Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 3, Dogmas and Customs of the Ancient Egyptians 2, from an exposition of the mysteries or religious dogmas and customs of the ancient Egyptians, Pythagoreans and Druids, also an inquiry into the origin, history and purport of Freemasonry, by John Fellows, AM. The genealogy of the gods. Though the Egyptians, by introducing great mysteries where there were none, have disfigured history and religion, yet we cannot deny them the glory of good regulations for polity and public order. Whatever was necessary, and must be done in common, was not left to the free will of private persons, but fixed to a certain time of the year, and proclaimed by public signs. In the beginning of the spring, or at the return of the first heats, which in Egypt come on in February, they cleaned their goods, houses and stables. Everything in a decayed state, being of no use to the Egyptian lands which the Nile sufficiently improved, was consumed by fire. This general purification was proclaimed by an Isis and a Horus, who had names agreeable to the work of the season. The Horus was called Hour, or Urim, the firebrands, and the Isis was called Obs, or Ops, mold or hoariness. Hour, whence the Latins derived their word hour or ver, the spring. They also had their Februa, that is, their general purifications in the month of February, which had its name from thence. From Abash putrescere musiduum fieri comes obs, mucir, petrudo, obsuferudot, the rotten corn, Joel 1:17. These purifications, which were transmitted from coast to coast, are still in use all over Europe towards the return of the fair weather in February or March. And the custom of lighting fires in the evening on certain days in the spring, for that purpose appointed, is still the amusement of youth in a multitude of cities and villages, where they faithfully observe the old rubric without knowing the reason of it. Even in Egypt, where the solemn feasts, falling back one day every fourth year, appeared in seasons to which they had no longer any relation, they forgot the motive of the institution of the Feast of the Firebrands, but they were always faithful in the observation of it. In the evening the inhabitants of Sais began their great feast with an illumination. So soon as the neighboring towns saw it, they lighted the like fires. Each did the same one after another, and all Egypt took a part in the feast by a general illumination. The moon of February, besides the visitation of houses, proclaimed two other operations. The one consisted in scouring the canals and channels of the Nile, and the other, which immediately preceded the harvests, was the decision of lawsuits. The priests during the year appeared but seldom in public, except at the times of religious affairs. But they went out in the spring, that is, in February, and met to judge the differences of private persons, that these might afterwards freely go about their respective works. The scouring of the ditches and canals was proclaimed in the assembly of the Neominia by an Isis that was called Tyt, or Tetis, and by a Horus whose name was Typhon, that is the mud, the raking up of the earth. Tit, Canum, Lutum. Father Pezron derives the name Typhon from the Celtic tit, the earth, and den, a man, Bailey. The assembly of the priests to judge the people was proclaimed by a Horus with a great beard and a scythe in his hand. He was indifferently called Sudek, Kiran, Chin and Tuna, or Saturn, and by an Isis with many breasts, and encompassed with the heads of animals. This Isis was on this occasion called Rhea. The Horus with his great beard denoted the assembly of the ancient men. The scythe in his hand denoted haymaking and the harvest, which immediately followed the assize. They called this figure Sudek, or Stadik, Justus, which means the just, Crone, Karen, splendor, that is the glory, the dignity, the majesty, or the crown, that is the circle of the judges, Chiun or Tuna, which means the assembly of the priests. In short, Soterim, Sota Judex, Soterim or Sotrim, Judices and Principes, Joshua 1-10. Sometimes executores, satellites or cetrum, which signifies the judges or the execution of the judgments. Justice among the Israelites was administered by two sorts of officers, Shophatim and Soterim, established in every city by the command which God gave to Moses, Deuteronomy 16:18. These posts were given to Levites, and there were 6,000 of them in David's time, 1 Chronicles 23:4. Dr. Adam Clarke's History of Israel, page 164. After the decision of the lawsuits of private persons, and while the people were busy about cutting down and threshing the corn, the judges continued to hold their sessions to provide by general regulating for all the exigencies of the state. And it was on account of their being assembled the rest of the year till the rising of the dog star in June or July, that the characteristic of the judgments, viz. The old man armed with a scythe, remained in his place till they saw a new Osiris, a new sun, that is, till the new year. We shall see the strange fables to which this particular circumstance gave birth. They by degrees lost the meaning of these plain figures and names that were in use at the feasts, in which the whole was become an invariable ceremonial. The current or the running writing caused the sense of them to be neglected. On the other hand, nothing contributed more to make it forgotten than the custom of not reckoning exactly the sacred year, and of always putting the beginning of it back a whole day every fourth year, so that the feasts and figures relating to the operations of the spring being placed in autumn or winter, and so of the rest, they no longer understood anything of what this multitude of figures meant, all being taken for so many men and women whose apotheosis was celebrated. The people assigned to them a genealogy agreeable to the order of their feasts. Osiris and Isis, who began the year, were the two great deities that held the first rank, and from whom they made the secondary gods and goddesses already spoken of to descend. But from whom shall Osiris and Isis, that is Jupiter and his wife, proceed? They, as well as their brothers Neptune and Pluto, are the children of that venerable old man who, of all the signs exposed, was what appeared the longest towards the end of the year, and whose place Jupiter afterwards took. According to the primitive order, a new Osiris and a new Isis, or the posted signs of the new year, appeared again in June or July. According to the order of later times, all these figures, it is true, succeeded each other in the same manner, but in seasons and months to which they had no longer any just relation. Thus Sudek, or Kronos, or Saturn, became father of Jupiter and Isis. Saturn, Rhea, Tethys, and Typhon were their forefathers. The Titans were looked upon as the children of Ur, or Urain, and of Ops. Several genealogists go no further. Others, as Diodorus, make Urain and Ops the children of Acmon. The Egyptians, in their genealogy, go back even to Vulcan. Now Acmon, the brazier, and Vulcan are but one and the same thing. Thus all these great personages that have peopled heaven, whom every country flattered themselves with having had for their inhabitants, to whom poets have attributed tragical adventures, and all the accidents of humanity, these great conquerors, the histories of whom our learned men are incessantly sifting, even so far as to penetrate into the political concerns that prompted them to act, prove at last to be, as well as Cancer, Capricorn, the Balance, or the Sphinx, mere ensigns or public marks and figures posted up to direct the people and regulate the feasts and public works all the year round. Saturn. Again, I find a proof of the same truth in the observations which the fable of Saturn naturally offers to my mind. Instead of painting him with a scythe to signify that the sessions of the judges are to be held in the time of harvest and haymaking, we sometimes find him represented with eyes before and behind, some of which are awake and the others asleep, and with 4 wings, 2 of which are spread and 2 closed, which marked out the penetration and continuance of the work of the judges, who relieved each other by succession night and day, to dispatch the affairs of the people and those of the state, without making anyone to linger under prejudicial and destructive delays. A new proof of Saturn's being a judge, or the symbol of justice, whose penetration nothing can escape, is that the poets, and above all Homer, most commonly calls him the penetrating, the sagacious, the subtle, the quick-sighted Saturn. Again, it was because Saturn, in its original, signified the execution of the judgments or the punishment of criminals that they usually said Saturn carried away somebody and demanded his victim every year. Thence came the opinion they had that Saturn would be worshipped by the effusion of human blood, and the barbarous custom which everywhere spread, making its way from Phoenicia into Africa and thence throughout Europe. It was because Saturn, or Crone, had a necessary relation to the equity of the judgments that were passed without any respect of persons, that Saturn was said to have reigned with perfect gentleness and integrity. They said, "Father, that a perpetual spring reigned in his time because the sessions of the judges were anciently inseparable from the finest month of the year. Such is constantly the month of February in Egypt. The custom of reckoning 365 days for the year, without intercalating one day at 4 years' end, by degrees displaced all the feasts and made people forget that the figures there exposed related to the circumstances of the season. In imitation of this usage, justice was anciently administered in Europe in the finest of our months, viz. In May. We still find in a multitude of places remains of this custom in the practice observed by the farmers of the duties and receipts of lords, of setting up branches with their leaves on, or a green arbor before the chief or manor house where the assizes were held formally and where executions of criminals were made. But all this preparation is grounded on the circumstance of the season in which justice was administered in remotest antiquity. It was in the finest of our months. The above-mentioned green arbor is still called the May, and the terms of magistrate and majesty seem to be borrowed from the name of the month in which these venerable assemblies were held in Europe. This month has received its name from the Pleiades, anciently called Maya, which then disengaged itself from the rays of the sun, distant 30 degrees and passed under Gemini. We again find a sensible token of the relation Saturn had to the judicial functions of the sacerdotal order in the disposal of the public treasure and the archives in the temple of Saturn. This was an imitation of the method of the Egyptians, who anciently put the public treasure and the records of the genealogies of families in the tower or labyrinth under the custody of the priests. In fine, there is no better proof that people were perfectly ignorant of the sense of the figures mistaken for deified personages than the notion which the Greeks framed to themselves of Saturn when he was brought into their country. The name of Crone, under which he was known to them, very plainly signified the majesty of the judicial assemblies, the crown or circle of the judges. But not knowing what this figure and its intention were, and finding a relation of sound between the name of Crone and that of Kronos, which among them signified time, they interpreted the whole symbol in that sense. The age of the figure squared with this incomparably well. But what were they to do with the scythe he carries in his hand? Why, he shall use it to cut down everything. Above all, the stones which they made him to devour in Syria seem to distinguish him perfectly well. Time consumes everything and preys upon the very stones. The following judicious remarks from the Mythological Dictionary of W. Howell, B.D., support the hypotheses of Pluche in regard to the manner in which names have been appropriated to persons that never had existence. Semiramis. The wonderful actions of Ninus and Semiramis may be read in diverse historians, Herodotus, Strabo, Diodorus, Siculus, Ctesias, etc. The accounts are inconsistent and incredible, and indeed what credit can be given to the history of a person, Semiramis, the time of whose life cannot be ascertained within 1,535 years? For so great is the difference of the extremes of the following numbers. According to Syncellus, she lived before Christ 2,177 years. Petavius makes the term 250. Helvacus 2,248. Eusebius 1,984. Mr. Jackson 1,964. Archbishop Usher 1,215. Philo Biblius from Sanchoniathon 1,200. Herodotus about 713. The history of Ninus and Semiramis is in great measure founded upon terms which have been misconstrued, and fictions have been invented in consequence of these mistakes. Under the character of Semiramis, we are certainly to understand a people called Semirim, a title assumed by the ancient Babylonians. They were called Semirim from their ensign, which was a dove, expressed Semiramis. It was used as an object of worship and esteemed the same as Rhea, the mother of the gods. It was a common mode of expression to call a tribe or a family by the name of its founders, and a nation by the head of the line. People are often spoken of collectively in the singular under such a patronymic. Hence we read in Scripture that Israel abode in tents, that Judah was put to the worst in battle, etc. When it was said that the Ninevite performed any great action, it has been ascribed to a person called Ninus, the supposed founder of Nineveh. But we may be assured that under the character of Ninus and Ninas, we are to understand the Ninevites, as by Semiramis is meant a people called Samarim. And the great actions of these two nations are in the histories of these personages recorded. But writers have rendered the account inconsistent by limiting what was an historical series of many ages to the life of a single person. The Ninevites and Samarim did perform all that is attributed to Semiramis and Ninus. They did conquer the Medes and largely extended their dominions. But these events were many ages after the foundation of the two kingdoms. It is said of this ideal personage that she was exposed among rocks but delivered and preserved by Simus, a shepherd, and was afterwards married to one Menon. She is likewise said to have constructed the first ship. Now Simus is a personage made out of Semar, or Sams, the divine token. Menon is the deus lunus, under which type the ark was reverenced in many regions, and as it was the first ship constructed with which the history of the dove was closely connected, they have given to Semiramis the merit of building it. Sesostris. The history of this personage has been admitted as credible by the most learned writers and chronologists, though they cannot determine the era of his reign within 1,000 years. Notice has been taken under several articles of the supposed conquerors of the earth, and among them of the reputed deities of Egypt under the names of Osiris, Perseus, etc. These are supposed, if they ever existed, to have lived in the first ages of the world when Egypt was in its infant state, and Sesostris is made one of the number. He is by some placed before Horus, and by some after. He is also represented under the different names of Sethos, Sethosis, Sesuthis, Secanthosis, and Sesostris. Osiris is said to have conquered the whole earth. Then Zeus, then Perseus, then Hercules, all nearly of the same degree of antiquity, if we may believe the best mythologists. Myrina comes in for a share of conquest in the time of Horus. After her, Thule subdues the whole from the eastern ocean to the great Atlantic, and as if nothing had been performed before, Sesostris succeeds and conquers it over again. By comparing the histories of ancient personages together, we may perceive that they bear a manifest similitude to one another, though they are attributed to different persons. Sesostris was Osiris, the same as Dionysius, Menes, and Noah. Origin of Apis and Mnevis. Nothing could be more convenient or more ingenious than the astronomical language, which immediately characterized each season and the works peculiar to it by making the governor of the earth enter into the 12 signs of the zodiac, whose names had a just relation to what successively passes upon the earth in the course of a year. Nothing so gross, on the contrary, or so pitiful as the historical sense which the people afterwards annexed to this language, and such is evidently the origin of the ridiculous doctrine of the transmigration of souls, which Pythagoras brought to Italy as a rare discovery. Generally, all the animals of which the stars bear the name were looked upon with veneration by the Egyptians as having been the first retreats of their gods, and as being very possibly appointed for that of their dead parents. People never looked without a religious awe upon those in which they knew Osiris and Isis had resided, such as the ram, the bull, the heifer, the goat, and the lion. Their ancient custom of carrying ceremonially at the feasts of certain seasons the animal whose name the house into which the sun entered went by, disposed the people of certain provinces to honor particularly the animal carried at the feasts that concurred with the conclusion of their harvest. Chance having produced a calf at Memphis which had some spots nearly in the figure of a circle or crescent, symbols so much reverenced among them, this singularity was taken by them for the characteristic of Osiris and Isis, stamped upon the animal which their gods had an affection for, and that this was an apparition of the governor, a visit which the protector of Egypt deigned to make them. This miraculous calf, after having served preferably to any other at the ordinary ceremonial, was lodged in the finest place in Memphis. All his motions were judged prophetical, and the people flocked to him with their offerings. He received the great name of Apis, which means the mighty, the powerful god. They took great care after his death to replace him with another that had nearly the same spots. When the marks desired were not neat and exact, they were improved with a pencil. They even seasonably and after a certain time prevented the indecency of his death by leading him in ceremony to a place where they drowned and then interred him very devoutly. This melancholy ceremony was intermixed with torrents of tears and was emphatically called Sampis, or the retreat of Apis, a name which was afterwards given to Pluto, the infernal Osiris. After the burial of Apis, his successor was sought for. Thus was this strange devotion perpetuated. A powerful motive contributed greatly to it, viz., it was lucrative. The inhabitants of Heliopolis, who made a separate dynasty or a kingdom different from that at Memphis, thought themselves too much in the favor of the sun, whose name their capital bore, not to partake of his visits or those of his son. They therefore soon had the sacred ox as well as those of Memphis. They called him Mnevis or Mnevis, which is the same thing as Mene, the mighty, or the same with Mehophis. And in choosing this magnificent name for him, they supposed other qualities and other functions in him no less capable of drawing crowds of people thither. Phyton or Typhon. Osiris, being become the common father of the Egyptians, was by degrees looked upon as the principle from which all the good that happened to Egypt sprung. In like manner, Phyton, when he was become the name of the symbol that signified the havoc of waters, was looked upon as an ill-minded spirit, as a principle fond of thwarting, perpetually intent upon crossing and prejudicing them. They made him the principle of all disorder, and charged him with all the physical evils they could not avoid, and all the moral evils which they did not care to lay to their own charge. Hence came the doctrine of the two opposite principles, equally powerful, incessantly striving against each other, and alternately vanquished and victorious. This doctrine, which from the Egyptians was handed down to the Persians under the names of Oromazes and Arimazes, is altogether different from ours, according to which God, conformably to the adorable views of his providence, employs the ministry of the spirits who have persevered in a spirit of uprightness, and leaves a certain measure of power to those who have fallen from it. The aversion of the Egyptians for this Phyton, their imaginary enemy, and according to them incessantly intent upon vexing them, went so far that they no longer dared to pronounce his name. However, we find it entire in the language of the Hebrews who had dwelt in Egypt and had contracted the habit of calling by that name the most mischievous of serpents, that is, the asp, Petu. The entire name of Phyton or Python is found again in the most ancient and most celebrated fables of paganism. There we see this terrible monster engaged with the God who enlightens the world and spreading desolation everywhere. Nothing has been more celebrated in antiquity than the victory of the sun. Nothing more abhorred than Phyton when, from a painted monster, he was become a being intent upon doing mischief. The Egyptians, fearing to defile themselves by the bare pronouncing of that detestable name, retained the letters of it and converted them into that of Typhon. Some people, even at this day, have a reluctance to pronounce the common English name of this Prince of Darkness. They call him the Devil, Old Nick, Old Harry, etc. We have seen how the cross, as well entire as abridged, was the mark of the increase of the Nile because it was the measure of it. When confined in the hand of Osiris, in the claws of the hawk, or the hand of Horus, it very plainly signified the overflowing of the Nile, regulated by the sun, strengthened by the wind, and subject to fixed rules. This cross, which in their vulgar writing, as likewise in the ancient Hebraic characters, in the Greek and the Latin alphabet, was the letter Tau. That the cross or the T suspended by a ring was taken by the Egyptians for the deliverance from evil, we may assure ourselves by consulting their practices, which are the surest interpretation of the opinion that governed them. They hung it round the neck of their children and of their sick people. They applied it to the strings or fillets with which they wrapped up their mummies, where we still find it. What can, in their ideas, signify a T placed near those to whom they wished health and life, if not the deliverance from the disease and death which they hoped to obtain by these superstitious practices? Hence we see how strangely they misapplied those figures which in their first institution related to the Nile, to husbandry, and to things totally foreign to the applications of succeeding times. This very probably is an introductive key wherewith one might strive to explain part of the meaning which the Egyptians of the later times have given to their sacred writing. The custom of the Egyptians appeared so beneficial and so important that it was adopted by other nations. The children and the sick most commonly wore a ticket, wherein was a T which they looked upon as a powerful preservative. In process of time, other characters were substituted in the room of the letter T, which was at first engraved on this ticket, but of which the other nations understood neither the meaning nor the intention. They often put a serpent in it, a Harpocrates, or the object of the devotions in vogue, nay, sometimes ridiculous figures, or even some that were of the utmost indecency. But the name of amulet, emolumentum malorum, that was given to this ticket, and which signifies the removal of the evil, most naturally represents the intention of the Egyptians, from whom this practice came. The above-mentioned practice, we have seen, arose from the instrument used for measuring the height of the inundation of the Nile, being an abridgment of it, and which was considered the salvation of Egypt. A like veneration is bestowed upon this figure, that is, the cross, by Roman Catholics, which, like other customs of the ancients, has probably been adopted by them without understanding its origin, and which they attribute to a different source. A spell which they no doubt consider more potent, however, is now generally used instead of the cross. This is called Gospels, and consists of short passages extracted from the Gospels by a priest, which is enclosed in a piece of silk and tied round the necks of children going to bed. The same superstition prevails among the Mahometans. Dr. Hume, in Walpole's Memoirs, speaking of modern Egypt, says, "The general remedy in cases of fever and other kinds of illness is a seifi from a priest, which consists of some sentence from the Quran, written on a small piece of paper and tied round the patient's neck. This, if the sick man recovers, he carefully preserves by keeping it constantly between his skull caps, of which he generally wears 2 or 3. Seifis are very commonly used by the Mahometans, being considered to possess much efficacy for the body as well as the soul, and occupy the same place in the estimation of the superstitious as did the frontlets of the Jews and the phylacteries of the early Christians." In regard to the sacred writing of the Egyptians, it is not improbable that its characters were originally formed from the figure of the nilometer, consisting of right angles and thence considered sacred. The Egyptian mysteries. We must not expect, we are told, that the priests of Isis or Plutarch or any other travelers who heard them talk can be able to give us any information about the true sense and meaning of their symbols. It was a mysterious theology which they took great care not to divulge. Those who were initiated therein engaged themselves by an oath never to communicate to the people any part of what had been revealed to them. Does not Herodotus often tell us that he is permitted upon no account whatever to reveal the names and the honors that were destined and annexed to certain deities, or what these deities were? The secret in this point being inviolable, are we to wonder that they have not explained themselves on the grounds which concern us, and can we judge of what they have not revealed? Let us then see, and this shall be the conclusion of our essay upon the Egyptian religion, what these mysteries so much spoken of were. And if possible, let us penetrate into these secrets in spite of the veils and barriers intended to render them inaccessible. Among the ancient Egyptian figures, there were some which could not well be mistaken for celestial gods, and of which it was difficult to lose the meaning, having at first been of infinite use to the people. Such were, for instance, the serpent, the canopus, and the hawk. We see therefore from the interpretation given of them by the grammarian Horapollo that in the 4th century the Egyptian priests still expressed the life or eternity of their gods by a serpent encompassing time, serpentem aureum diis suis circumponent, that they represented the overflowing of the Nile by 3 pitchers and denoted the wind by a hawk spreading her wings, accipiter alis in aere pretensis, ventum significat. But the people, having once forgotten the sense of the sacred writing and taken human figures for celestial powers, never gave over inventing histories, and the priests who preserved this writing adapted it to their histories, which renders it worthy of contempt and altogether different from the ancient as to the meaning. The priests at first retained a part of the primitive explications. Thence comes the mixture of great and little in the Egyptian theology and in the Eleusinian, which was the same. In there more than anywhere remained the ancient footsteps of the truths, which constituted the principal groundwork of the religion of the patriarchs. But it would have been dangerous for the Egyptian priests to attempt undeceiving the people and divert them from the pleasing thought that Osiris and Isis were 2 real personages and were besides of their country and the protectors of Egypt. This chimera and all the others in appearance were authorized by the agreement of the monuments with the common phrase. The actions of Osiris and Isis were incessantly mentioned. The people believed what they saw and what they heard. The perpetual recital of as many historical facts as there were figures and ceremonies exhibited completed their errors and rendered them invincible. If our councils and the most venerable of our bishops have had so much ado to abolish among the people the belief of certain legends unworthy the majesty of our religion, and which were connected with no monument capable of countenancing them, how can we conceive that the Egyptian priests were able to take from a people immersed in ignorance and cupidity the extravagant stories which universal custom offered to their minds on sight of the personages and animals wherewith the places of their assemblies were filled? It is much more natural to think that the priests themselves, like the rest, yielded to the persuasion of being under the patronage of their ancestors, transported into the stars, and now the moderators of the sun, the moon, and of all nature. The people, in their fanatic enthusiasm, would have torn in pieces any that should have dared to deny the history of Osiris and Isis. Truth was then altered and obscured by the very priests. They first accustomed themselves to these notions because it was dangerous not to comply with them, and afterwards became themselves the most zealous defenders of them. The whole came on by degrees. They first complied with the common language because they thought they could not stem the torrent, but they studied in private what they could collect of the interpretation of the ancient writing. Thus they at once admitted both the popular stories and the explications that demolished them. They only took care to require profound secrecy from those whom they would instruct in a more solid manner. Thus, instruction assumed a mysterious and important air without altering anything in what the people believed. It only mentioned a more perfect state, and a kind of knowledge of which none became capable till after many trials and efforts, which suited not the common sort of men. Thus they avoided exciting the fury of the people. This was already a crying injustice in those priests to detain truth captive and to appropriate it exclusively to themselves. So criminal a disposition could not but occasion a still greater impairing of truth, and really everything degenerated more and more every day. The probation of the disciples and the oath of an inviolable secrecy, being very remarkable practices, were perpetuated with great exactness. The ceremonial part easily supports itself in all religions and is often embellished rather than diminished, because it is of no importance to the passions which it never disturbs, and sometimes really indulges. It was not with truth and instruction as with the ceremonial. They were disfigured from age to age, sometimes through the ignorance of the priests, sometimes by their avarice, but principally by their fondness for systematic reveries, with which the most subtle among them tried to explain the symbolical writing, and of which they were much fonder than of a few plain and over-simple truths, which their predecessors were contented to teach them. Therefore, danger and fear first gave birth to the secrecy of the Egyptian instructions, and have converted the practices of the ancient ceremonial of the public religion into so many mysteries, to the knowledge of which none could be admitted but such as had given proof of a profound respect for the objects of religion, of a perfection which common men could not attain, and of an unconquerable taciturnity. But then those who were initiated thought themselves of a clan superior to the rest of men, and their condition appeared worthy the envying. The priests, being sure of the discretion of their disciples, might very well acknowledge to them the grossness of the meaning which the people annexed to these symbols, but their shameful connivance suffered error to get so much ground that the piety of the initiated themselves sunk into a mere ceremonial, and the small remains of truths which subsisted amongst so many fabulous stories remained there stifled as it were, and without any useful effect. The priests themselves outdid the popular superstitions, and out of custom and from interested views preserved the preparatory ceremonies and the religion of silence that gave the people a high notion of the ministers and of their learning. I have given the literal translation of most of the terms made use of in these mysteries. Neither the Greeks nor the Romans understood the meaning of them, because they are Phoenician. The very name, neither the motive nor the purport or destination of them. It was no mystery, being also a Phoenician word which signifies a veil, an envelopment. We are, on this very account, authorized to look out in the Chananian language for the meaning of the other terms made use of in the mysteries. Mistaret mistor velum in absconsio latibulum. Psalm 10, Isaiah 4. But if the terms used in the Eleusinian feasts shall perfectly concur with the sense I have ascribed to the pieces that were most in use in the symbolical writing and ceremonies, the result will evidently be that the figures originally appointed to instruct the people have been converted into so many imaginary gods, and that we have obtained the true original of all these inhabitants of the poetical heaven. The series of Sicily and Eleusis is no other than the Egyptian Isis, brought into those places by Phoenician merchants, who made themselves rich by transporting the corn of Lower Egypt into the places whither the scarcity of provisions drew them, and generally on the different coasts of the Mediterranean, where they had offices and establishments. The ceremonial of the rural feasts had in their hands taken a turn somewhat different. The mother of harvests there lamented her daughter instead of bewailing her husband as the Egyptian ritual would have it. This accepted, the ground and intention were the same. Cicero, in On the Nature of the Gods, makes the following remarks on this subject. The sovereignty and power over the earth is the portion of a god to whom we, as well as the Greeks, have given a name that denotes riches. In Latin, dis, in Greek, Phyton, because all things arise from the earth and return to it. He forced away Proserpine, in Greek called Persephone, by which the poets mean the seed of corn, from their fiction of Ceres, the mother of Proserpine, seeking for her daughter, who was hidden from her. She is called Ceres, which is the same as Geres, from gerendis frugibus, meaning bearing fruit, the first letter of the word being altered after the manner of the Greeks, for by them she is called Demeter, the same as Demeter, that is Mother Earth. Punch derives Proserpine thus. From peri, fruit, corn, and sapphan, to hide, comes Persephone, the corn lost. It may be remarked that the flambeau or torch, which Ceres, according to the fable, is said to have carried night and day in search of her daughter Proserpine, is a symbol of the lost sun, without whose aid no fruit or corn could be found or produced. The feasts instituted in honor of Ceres were called Thesmophoria, whose principal parts may be reduced to three, viz. The preparations, the processions, and the autopsia, or the sight of truth. The preparations, the long enumeration of which may be read in Mursius, Graecia Feriata, had for their object the frugality, chastity, and innocence that were necessary to the worshippers. The processions consisted in the carriage of the sacred baskets, wherein they enclosed a child and a golden serpent, a van, grains, cakes, and all the other symbols of which we have made the enumeration in another place. If in the feasts of Ceres or Isis men carried to an extravagant excess the form of the gestures and situations, the scrupulous recitals of the set forms of prayers, the length of the vigils, outward purity, abstinence, the forbearance of all pleasures, and the shunning all manner of distraction, it is because the whole of religion was reduced to these outward practices. Those who observed them knew neither the motive nor the purport or destination of them. It was no longer any but an artificial devotion or the skeleton of the ancient religion. But any upright, unprejudiced mind will easily discern in them the intentions of the first founders, who knew the full value of rule, the beauty of order, and the benefit of recollection. A long description of all the purifications and other ceremonies that filled up the first of the 9 days of devotion consecrated to Ceres would have tired out my readers, and is no part of my plan, which chiefly aims at obtaining the origin of these establishments. It will be the same with the long procession formerly made from Athens to Eleusis, and with the several marches peculiar to each of the 9 days. The Greeks had built the particulars of this minute ceremonial upon the little adventures that composed the wonderful story of the migration of Ceres into their country. But this my reader is acquainted with. What was carried in the feasts of Ceres at Eleusis is the same that was carried in the feasts of Isis. Let us therefore pass on to the explication of the autopsia, or the manifestation of truth, which was in a manner the last act of this representation and was the whole purport of the mysteries. After a horrid darkness, lightnings, thunderclaps, and an imitation of what is most shocking in nature, the serenity which at last succeeded discovered 4 personages magnificently dressed, and whose habits were all mysterious. The most brilliant of all, and who was especially called the Hierophant, or the expounder of sacred things, was dressed so as to represent the being that governs the universe. The second was was the flambeau bearer and had relation to the sun. The third, who was called the adorer and who kept near an altar, represented the moon. The fourth was called the messenger of the gods, or Mercury, which corresponds to the Egyptian Anubis, with his dog's head and measure of the Nile accompanied by two serpents, and is nothing but the wholesome advice which the dog star timely gives to men to make off at the increase of the waters and thereby secure their subsistence. Nothing could be better contrived than these magnificent ceremonies, whereby the Egyptians incessantly recalled to the minds of the assistants the belief of the first men concerning the judgment of God, and the hopes which are to quiet the minds of the just at the approach of death. What an indestructible tradition, attended with constant practices, had been able to preserve of the ancient doctrine, proved at last so very opposite to the popular notions, that the priests thought themselves under the necessity of using much circumspection, and of having recourse not only to the trial of their disciples, but also to the oath of secrecy. The reason of the priests themselves went astray in this labyrinth of obscure signs and mysterious practices. Then came on systems. One looked out among all this apparatus of ceremonies and fables for a complete set of physics. Another tried to find out a complete body of moral and instructive maxims under the color of the most scandalous fables. Others imagined they had found the most profound metaphysics therein. Nor does the simplicity of the Egyptian appear by much so shocking as the sublime nonsense of a Platonic, who sees monades and triades everywhere, who, in a figure of Isis exposed in the middle of an assembly of husbandmen, finds the archetype world, the intellectual world, and the sensible world, or who seeks in the feet of a goat the picture of universal nature, or who finds out in the horn of an ox the efficacy of the impressions of his imaginary genii. Thus the learned, from a habit of diving into matters and of looking out for extraordinary explanations, have perplexed a thing of itself simple. A few regular assemblies accepted, in which by public authority were preserved some footsteps of truth. Together with some ancient customs, the whole went on from bad to worse, from the liberty of embellishments and interpretations. The gods were multiplied in the popular discourses as much as the symbols, and even in proportion to the different names given one and the same symbol. Oftentimes the minutest equivocations, proceeding from a variety in the pronunciation, the diversity of dresses of the same figure, nay, a bare change of place, a trifle added or retrenched, gave birth to a new god. We may see in Plutarch's treatise, but above all in Eusebius's evangelical preparation, the strange variety of adventures and employments which the Africans, the Phoenicians, and the Phrygians attributed to the same gods. The celestial court was not the same in Egypt as in Greece. In Egypt it was Osiris that gave light to the world. In Greece, Osiris or Jupiter was freed from that care. The scepter and thunderbolt were left to him, but the chariot of the day was given to Horus or Apollo, who in his quality of symbol of the rural works bore by way of abbreviation the marks of the situation of the sun or the characteristic of the season. Jupiter could neither do everything nor be everywhere. Lieutenants were then given him, each with separate districts. Everything assumed a settled form. The histories of the gods were composed, and by attributing to them what each nation in particular was pleased to publish on their account, by adding thereto the histories of the ministers of the temples and those of the kings who had favored their worship. But chiefly by excusing the disorders of women on account of the pretended disguises of these gods possessed with their charms, they formed that monstrous lump of mythology, in which it is no wonder that we find no sense, no coherency, no order of place or time, nor any kind of regard either to reason or good manners, though the major part of these fabulous recitals be utterly extravagant. Yet as they have made part of the strange theology of our forefathers, men have at all times endeavored to find out the true origin of them. I have ventured my own conjectures on the same subject, because they appeared to me to amount nearly to a certainty, and the whole might be unravelled with no less decency than benefit. It is no longer so with regard to the minute particulars of these extravagances. The collection of them would be the matter of very large volumes, and there is indeed no subject upon which it will be more lawful to set bounds to one's knowledge. The foregoing article has been very much curtailed as it is intended to give a full account of the ancient mysteries from Bishop Warburton's Divine Legation of Moses, in which the subject is treated of more at large and in some respect evidently with a better understanding of it than the Abbé Pluche possessed. The horrors exhibited at the commencement of the ceremony were intended to represent the condition of the wicked in another life, and the closing scene portrayed the abode of the blessed. The miseries of Tartarus and the happiness of Elysium were contrasted, and being pronounced by holy priests, in whom the vulgar in barbarous ages placed implicit confidence, to be a true picture of what actually takes place in a future state of existence, must have produced a most powerful effect. This scene is imitated in the Royal Arch degree of Masonry, originally with the same view as the archetype, and as in the original mysteries, it forms the last act or degree of ancient Masonry. The candidates are kept in the dark by being hoodwinked. Thunder and lightning are represented by the firing of pistols, rolling cannonballs, etc. In the conclusion, the aspirants are brought to light and presented to what is called the Grand Council, consisting of 3 personages denominated High Priest, King, and the Holy Scribe, on whose decorations some $100 are expended in order duly to prepare them to sustain the exalted characters allotted to them. These 3 are the principal personae of the drama. The 4th, and next in dignity, is styled the Captain of the Host, who is stationed at the right hand of the Grand Council, and whose duty is to receive their orders and see them duly executed. The High Priest corresponds with the Hierophant of the Mysteries, the King with the flambeau bearer, the Sun, who was deemed the king and governor of the world, the Holy Scribe with Isis, the adorer, hence the attribute wholly applied to him, and the captain of the host with Anubis, Hermes, or Mercury, the messenger of the gods. The identity of these institutions cannot be mistaken. The auguries. My readers, ever so little conversant in ancient history, may remember to have often seen the Romans, the Sabines, the Hetrurians, the Greeks, and many other nations very careful in never attempting any important undertaking without previously consulting the birds and drawing favorable or ill consequences, sometimes from the number and kind of the birds that traversed the air, sometimes from the quarter whence they began their flight and the different course they took. We may likewise remember that, in order not to be obliged to wait long for a bird which chance may not immediately offer, the priests of the false deities had introduced the custom of the sacred chickens, brought into the middle of the assembly of the people in a cage, for the magistrates gravely to observe their ways and motions. They had reduced into an art, and referred to constant and settled rules, all the consequences to be drawn with regard to futurity, from the several methods in which these whimsical animals let fall or swallowed the food offered to them. Have not the priests of paganism, either out of interested views or from an infatuation for these chimerical rules, 1,000 times spoiled or put a stop to the most important and best concerted undertakings out of regard to a fowl that had refused her meat? Augustus and many other persons of understanding have, without any fatal consequences, despised the chickens and divination. But when the generals in the times of the Republic had miscarried in any enterprise, the priest and people cast the whole blame of it on the heedlessness with which the sacred chickens had been consulted, and more commonly still, on the general's having preferred his own forecast to that of these fowls. Nor can one indeed, without some indignation, see these dangerous sillinesses continue in the highest esteem and credit among people full of magnanimity, and the greatest genius seemingly making serious apologies for them. Tully has handed to us a good saying of Cato, who declared that one of the most surprising things to him was how one soothsayer could look another in the face without laughing. I do not doubt but this judicious orator, when he was discharging his functions as a priest of the auguries, was always ready to change his countenance whenever he happened to see any of his colleagues walking with a grave, stately air and lifting up the augural staff. He was perfectly sensible of the vanity of these practices. After having observed in the second book of divination that the Romans had never been concerned in a matter of greater consequence than that of the quarrel between Caesar and Pompey, he freely confesses that the augurs, aruspices, and oracles had never been more frequently consulted, but that the answers, whose number was endless, had not been followed by the events they foretold, or else had been succeeded by such as were quite contrary. However, Tully, notwithstanding this confession, which wholly demolishes the art of prediction, yet out of politic views defends the practice of it. He preferred leaving the people in their error to the risk of provoking them by endeavoring to free them from a pernicious and criminal superstition. It may be presumed that the risk which Cicero was unwilling to hazard in this case was the loss of popularity and the emolument arising from the priestly office. Self-interest in all ages of the world has been the moving principle of action, with the cunning and designing to impose upon the credulity of ignorance. Observing the feeding or flight of birds, or inspecting the entrails of a bullock, thereby to predict future events, is not more ridiculous nor less creditable to the understanding of the human species than solemn practices that might be mentioned, which are in vogue at the present day. Anciently, or at the time of the institution of the Sibyls, men, before sowing or planting, used to say, "Let us first consult the birds," nor was there anything better understood. People were satisfied when they had observed this custom with care. These birds signified the winds, the observation and course of which determined the propriety of rural works. But men, in process of time, very earnestly invoked the birds themselves. The cock, commonly placed by the side of Horus and Anubis or Mercury, very plainly signified what was to be done in the morning, as the owl marked out the assemblies that were to be held in the evening. Cocks were then made so many new monitors foretelling futurity, and the owl acquired in this matter a talent which many people earnestly contend she is still possessed of. When this bird, which is an enemy to light, happens to shriek as she passes by the window of a sick person where she perceives it, you never can beat it out of their head that this shrieking is a foreboding of his end. Origin and falsehood of the Sibyls. It is from a sensible abuse in astronomy, or of the custom of consulting certain stars, that the oracles of the Sibyls were introduced. Harvest has always been the great object of the desires and attention of all nations. In order, therefore, to regulate the manuring of their lands, their ploughing, sowing, and the other operations of concern to the bulk of society, men had their eyes fixed on the virgin that bears the ear of corn and which is the mark of the time of harvest. They observed how far the sun was remote from it, and on this account they generally used to consult and have recourse to the Virgin, a language as reasonable as the practice expressed by it. They at first gave this constellation the name Sibyl Ergone, the reddening ear of corn, because it is exactly the circumstance for which men wait to begin their harvest, and because their crop ripens when the sun draws near this collection of stars. From Shibul or Shibul et Spica, and from Daniel 5:7, Ergon purpura, the purple ear of corn, Spica rubescens. They afterwards called it sometimes Sibyl, sometimes Erigone. This name Erigone, rendered in Greek by that of Erythrae, which corresponds to it and signifies red, gave birth to the Egyptian Sibyl. There was certainly an advantage in consulting her, and her answers were very just to regulate husbandry, so long as she was taken for what she was. That is, for a cluster of stars under which the sun placed himself at the time which brought on harvest and reddened the ear of corn. And because the Egyptian harvest did not fall under that sign, but under the ram or the bull, it is that Egypt flocked to the oracles of Ammon or of Apis, and had so particular an affection for Isis, with the horns of a heifer, the ancient proclamation of their harvest, whereas all the East consulted the Erythraean Sibyl in order to be assured of a plentiful crop. This language became the matter of fables. Our maid, changed from a sign to a prophetess, had no doubt the most perfect knowledge of futurity, since people came from all parts to ask her questions. The excessive wickedness of mankind at last obliged her to quit their abodes, to go, and in the heavens take possession of the place due to her. Many countries assumed to themselves the honor of having given birth to this Sibyl, nor would it be a hard matter to find 7 instead of 1. All the current predictions, among which some strokes of the prophecies addressed to the Hebrews are found, in time past, for the answers of these Sibyls. See upon this subject the excellent remarks of P. Catrou on the 5th Eclogue of Virgil. The American reader should be aware that the term corn is used in England as a generic term for all seeds that grow in ears. The French word, here translated corn, is bleu, which signifies grain, wheat. Bleu de Turkey or dinde means maize, Indian corn. Wheat as it ripens puts on a reddish hue, which is not the case with Indian corn, although red ears are sometimes found among it. Grain in English seems the most proper term for the genus of the different species. In Masonic lodges, the master is stationed in the east, representing Osiris the sun, and the senior warden in the west, representing Isis or Virgo, the sign of harvest. His duty is to pay the craft their wages, which alludes metaphorically to the reward the husbandman receives in the produce of his labor when the sun arrives at this sign. This is indicated by a painting representing a sheaf of wheat, which is hung back of this officer's chair. The password of the fellow craft at this station, to entitle him to pay, is shibboleth, the reddening ear of wheat. Can anything more conclusively point out the astronomical caste of Freemasonry? It must have been at a very remote period when the Egyptian harvest occurred, as above stated, during the passage of the sun, either under the sign of the ram or the bull. Volney, in his travels in Egypt and Syria, observes, "As the sun approaches the Tropic of Capricorn, the winds become variable and tempestuous. They most usually blow from the north, the northwest and west, in which points they continue during the months of December, January and February, which is the winter season in Egypt as well as with us. The vapor of the Mediterranean, condensed by the coldness of the atmosphere, descends in mists and rains." Conjuration. I'm still to inquire into the origin of an art far more important than all the foregoing. This is necromancy, the art of calling up the spirits of the dead and of making them speak. The reader will not be displeased here to find the key of the occult languages and to be acquainted with how magicians went about asking questions of hell and conversing with the devils. The science of communing with departed spirits, supposed to have been lost for many centuries, is believed by the Swedenborgians to have been communicated to the founder of their sect, Emanuel Swedenborg. He asserts that in the year 1743, the Lord manifested himself to him by a personal appearance, and at the same time opened his spiritual eyes so that he was enabled constantly to see and converse with spirits and angels. A respect for the human body, which was believed to be destined for a better state to come and one day to rise from the dust, induced the First Nations to inter the dead in a decent manner and always to join to this melancholy ceremony wishes and prayers, which were expressions or a profession of their expectation. Funeral assemblies were the most frequent because men died every day, and these meetings were repeated on every anniversary. They were not only the most common but also the most regular. Everything was simple in the ancient feasts. Men met upon some high and remarkable place. They made there a small pit, wherein to consume the entrails of the victims by fire. They made the blood to flow into the same pit. Part of the flesh was presented to the ministers of the sacrifice. They boiled the rest of the offering, immolated, and ate it, sitting near the fire. By degrees they swerved from this simplicity. What had been approved on some important occasion afterwards passed into custom and became a law. The number, the characters, and the histories of the objects which men took for gods afterwards gave birth to 1,000 varieties, which appeared very important rites and necessary precautions. Whoever should have neglected one single point of the ceremonial prescribed had nothing less than the plague or famine to apprehend. Whenever the gods in that case were contented with only sending a transitory tempest or some furious beast among them, the fault was reckoned very cheaply atoned for. Each feast, having its proper service and decorations, had a peculiar name. It was not thus with the funeral assemblies. Nothing was changed in them. They were void of joy and decoration. Men went on with practicing what had ever been done. The families, in interring their dead, were accustomed to a common rubric which was perpetual. It is then in the service of the funerals especially that we may again find the principles of the usages of primitive antiquity. At these solemnities they continued to make a ditch, to pour out wine, oil, honey, milk, or some other liquors in use, to shed the blood of the victims, to roast their flesh, to eat it in common, sitting round the pit or hearth, and discoursing of the virtues of him they came to lament. These assemblies continued to bear the name given to all solemn convenings. while the other feasts, on account of the diversity of the ceremonies, were called Saturnalia, Dionysiaca, Palilia, etc. The funeral assemblies were simply called the manes, that is, the covering or regulation. Thus, the manes and the dead became two synonymous words, or were indifferently used one for another. And as the things which gave names to the feasts were generally become the objects of an extravagant worship, the manes or the dead became likewise the object reverenced in the funeral ceremonies. The strange facility with which the minute parts of the universe were deified is a hint to us how the custom was introduced of directing prayers, vows, and religious worship to the dead whom they had loved, whose praises were celebrated, and who were thought to enjoy the most refined knowledge after they had, together with their body, cast off the frailties of humanity. From Manim Distributiones Vices Reditus Solemnitas. This name was given to the symbolical figures. In particular, it remained the name of the image of the dead person which characterized a funeral assembly. The ancient sacrifices were not only Eucharistical. In the times when the Most High was as yet worshipped, they were looked upon as an alliance contracted with Him, and whereby they engaged themselves to be faithful to Him. I shall here mention neither the reasons nor any instances of it. The former are palpable, and the Scripture abounds with the latter. All nations, when they sacrificed either to the gods they had framed to themselves, or to the dead whose memory was dear to them, thought they entered into an alliance, conversed and familiarly ate with them. But this familiarity engrossed their thoughts, most particularly in the funeral assemblies, in which they were as yet full of the memory of the persons whom they had tenderly loved, and who, as they thought, took always a great part in the concerns of their family and country. We have heretofore observed how cupidity and ignorance, having rendered all men indifferent as to justice, had led them astray as to the object of their worship, and had afterwards converted every part of it into so many means of being relieved in their illness, instructed in futurity, and provided all proper means to succeed in all their undertakings. Every object in nature spoke to them. The birds in the heaven, the serpents and other animals on the earth, a simple rod in the hand of their minister, and all the instruments of religion were so many oracles and prophetical signs. They read the stars, and the gods spoke or revealed their intentions to them from one end of nature to the other. This covetous and gross religion, which applied to the gods merely to ask them questions in matters of interest, was no less inquisitive and thought it had a right to be still better served in the funeral sacrifices than in all the rest. Men in these ceremonies thought they had to deal with affectionate gods, which, on account of the concern they still had in the prosperity of their family, could not but inform them in time of whatever might be of service or detrimental to them. The whole apparatus of the funerals was then again interpreted in the same manner as that of the other feasts, and the whole was converted into so many methods of divination. The ceremonies of the manes, though they were but the bare practices of the assemblies of the primitive times, being in every respect different from those observed in the other feasts, appeared so many different methods of conversing with the dead and of obtaining the desired information from them. Who then could doubt? But it was in order familiarly to converse with their ancient friends that men sat down round a pit, into which they had thrown the oil, the flour, and the blood of the victim they had killed to their honor. How could it be doubted but that this pit, so different from the altars set up and pointing towards heaven, was a suitable ceremony and peculiarly belonging to the dead? The dead evidently took pleasure in these repasts, and especially in what was poured into the pit for them. Doubtless they came to consume the honey and the liquors which disappeared from thence, and if their friends were contented with offering them liquors only, no doubt it was because their condition as dead persons would not admit of gross foods. Men were then so extravagantly credulous as to believe that the phantoms came to drink and voluptuously to relish these liquors, while their relations feasted on the rest of the sacrifice around the pit. After the repast in common between the dead and the living came the interrogation, or particular calling up of the soul for which the sacrifice was appointed, and who was to explain her mind. Everybody is sensible that an inconvenience attended the ceremony, it being to be apprehended that the dead might crowd about the ditch to get a share in this effusion which they were so very greedy of, and leave nothing for the dear soul for whom the feast was designed. This was provided against. The relations made 2 ditches. In one they threw in wine, honey, water and flour to amuse the generality of the dead. In the other they poured out the blood of the victim, then to be eaten in common by the family. They sat upon the brink of the latter, and with their swords near them they kept off by the sight of these instruments the crowd of dead who had no concern in their affairs. They, on the contrary, invited and called up by his name the deceased, whom they had a mind to cheer and consult. They desired him to draw near. The dead, seeing that there was there no security for them, flocked and swarmed round the ditch, the access to which was free, and politely abandoned the other to the privileged soul, who had a right to the offering, and who knew the bottom of the affairs about which she was to be consulted. The questions made by the living were distinct and easy to be understood. The answers, on the contrary, though very certain, were neither so quick nor so easy to be unraveled. But the priests who had been taught in their labyrinth how to understand the voice of the gods, the answers of the planets, the language of the birds, the serpents, and the mutest instruments, easily understood the dead and became their interpreters. They reduced it into an art, whose most necessary point and what best suited the condition of the dead was silence and darkness. They retired into the deeper caves, they fasted and lay upon the skins of the sacrificed beasts. When they waked, or after a watch which was fitter to turn their brains than to reveal hidden things to them, they gave for answers the thought or dream which had most affected them, or they opened certain books appointed for that use. A similar custom is still practiced by some superstitious people who, when in doubt about what they ought to determine in particular circumstances, open the Bible, and the first passage that strikes their eyes is expected to indicate the proper course. And the first word which offered at the opening of them was precisely that of the prophecy expected, or in short, the priest, and sometimes the person himself who came to consult, took care at going out of the cave to listen with attention to the very first words he could possibly hear, from what part soever they proceeded, and they were to him in lieu of an answer. These words for certain had no manner of relation or connection with the business in hand, but they were turned so many ways, and the sense of them so violently wrested, that they must needs have given way some small matter. Commonly enough, they had in appearance some relation to it. They sometimes, instead of the foregoing methods, had recourse to what they called sortes, viz., a number of tickets on which there were some words written at random or some verses already current or newly coined. These tickets being thrown into an urn, they were stirred very well together, and the first ticket that was drawn was gravely given to the distressed family as the means to make them easy. Methods of divination were multiplied without end. The whole of religion was almost converted into so many methods of knowing futurity. See the dissertation of Van Dale upon the heathen oracles. See the history of the oracles. This matter has been sufficiently treated upon by the learned. It would be needless to resume it. It is evident that the practices above mentioned were extremely fit everywhere to spread this extravagant persuasion which is still preserved among the people, that we may converse with the dead and that they often come to give us advices. If I can again supply my readers with the proofs of this custom, or rather of this perverse abuse of the funeral ceremonies, I shall, methinks, have sufficiently shown that the opinions of men upon the gods, the dead, and the answers that may be obtained from either of them are nothing but a literal and gross interpretation made of very plain signs, and of still plainer ceremonies whose purport was to express certain truths and to fulfill certain duties. Because all nations flocked to high places there to shed the blood of the victims into a trench and to converse with a dead person by keeping off others by the sight of a sword, it is that Scripture so often and in so express a manner forbids the Israelites to assemble upon high places, or, which was frequently the same thing, to hold their assembly near the blood, or to eat sitting round any pit sprinkled with the blood of the victims. The 70 interpreters, knowing perfectly that this was what drew the people to the high places, have very well translated this passage of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 26, and others the like, by these words, "Ye shall not go and eat upon the mountains." Here to eat is the same thing as to sacrifice. Masonic writers say their brethren used to meet on the highest hills. This doctrine applies to the predecessors of Freemasons, but not to the craft, whose assemblies were always held in a lodge room guarded by a member at the door with a drawn sword. The first word spoken upon raising the dead body of Hiram was to be substituted for the lost Master Mason's word, provided it was not found upon him. This idea is evidently from the superstitious practices mentioned above at the funeral anniversaries. In concluding my extracts and remarks on the interesting works of the Abbé Pluche, I will take some notice of what he says of the dog days, which are continually recorded in almanacs when probably neither the authors nor readers know anything of their origin or the propriety or use of their being retained in such registers. According to our author, the rising of the dog star was generally accompanied with what the Egyptians called the Etesian northern wind, that continued to blow for 40 days in succession. When this wind failed to occur at this period, or was too light to be of use in causing the swelling of the Nile to a sufficient height, a general sadness of the people ensued. The probability, therefore, is that while the inhabitants remained idle on the high ground watching the progress of the inundation, these 40 days were passed very much in fasting and other acts of devotion to gain the favor of their gods in this respect. Indeed, the author relates a story that prevailed among the Cretians that corroborates this opinion, which is that through the displeasure of the gods, this wind was not permitted to blow for a considerable time. But after repeated sacrifices, the gods at length granted the return of the Etesian wind, and its constant blowing during the 40 days that followed the rising of the dog star, called the dog days, which again brought abundance upon the earth. The people, he says in another place, were warned to observe the dog days. Volney remarks that about the end of July, during all the month of August and half of September, the winds in Egypt remain constantly in the north and are moderate, brisker in the day, however, and weaker at night. The dog days in calendars calculated for the United States are generally noted as commencing on the 30th of July and ending on the 10th of September, making 42 days. It is highly probable that the Roman Catholic Lent has grown out of this ancient custom in regard to the dog days, accommodated, however, in respect to the time of its observance, to the circumstances of countries differently situated to that of Egypt. Such an essential change in the usual habit of living is, no doubt, very detrimental to health, and probably causes the premature death of thousands annually. The requirement of abstinence from meat on Fridays and Saturdays is founded upon the same principle. A breach of this rule of the politico-religious Church of Rome is placed in the list of damnable sins in a ritual issued even under the reign of the Emperor Napoleon, with his signature attached, ordering its observance by all Catholics throughout his dominions. Thus the fastings and mortifications originally got up to appease the fickle and vindictive gods of paganism have, without the least propriety or reason, been incorporated into the systems of some sects of professed Christians. By this establishment, the Catholic is required to abstain from eating meat for 40 days, except by special indulgence granted by a priest. Those, therefore, to whom it is inconvenient to pay for indulgences are under the necessity of restricting themselves to fish and vegetable diet during the above term. I will here observe that personages which Mr. Pluche declares to be mythological, never having had existence, will be considered by other writers quoted in this work as real historical persons. Some of his hypotheses in other respects may also be contrary to the doctrines of authors here cited. I shall generally pass such discrepancies without comment, leaving the reader to form his own opinion. To Abbé Pluche's account of Egypt, I will add a few extracts from a recent and very valuable work entitled A View of Ancient and Modern Egypt by the Reverend Michael Russell, LLD. Literature and Science of the Ancient Egyptians. In Egypt, the use of the hieroglyph was not entirely superseded by the invention of an alphabet. For many purposes connected with religion and even with the more solemn occupations of civil life, the emblematical style of composition continued to enjoy a preference, on a principle similar to that which disposes the Jew to perform his worship in Hebrew and the Roman Catholic in Latin. There appears also to have been a mixed language used by the priests, partaking at once of hieroglyphics and of alphabetical characters, which, in allusion to the class of men by whom it was employed, was denominated hieratic. Hence, in process of time, the Egyptians found themselves in possession of three different modes of communication: the hieroglyphic, properly so called the hieratic, and the demotic, or common. This distinction is clearly recognized in the following well-known passage, extracted from the works of Clemens Alexandrinus. "Those who are educated among the Egyptians," says he, "learn first of all the method of writing called the epistolographic, secondly, the hieratic, which the sacred scribes employ, and lastly, the most mysterious description, the hieroglyphic, of which there are two kinds, the one denoting objects in a direct manner by means of the initial sounds of words, the other is symbolical. Of the symbolical signs, one class represents objects by exhibiting a likeness or picture, another by a metaphorical or less complete resemblance, and a third by means of certain allegorical enigmas. Thus, to give an example of the three methods in the symbolical division, when they wish to represent an object by the first, they fix upon a distant resemblance, such as a circle when they want to indicate the sun, and a crescent when their purpose is to denote the moon. The second, or metaphorical, allows a considerable freedom in selecting the emblem, and may be such as only suggests the object by analogous qualities. For instance, when they record the praises of kings in their theological fables, they exhibit them in connection with figurative allusions which shadow forth their good actions and benign dispositions. In this case, the representation is not direct, but metaphorical. Of the third method of symbolical writing, the following will serve as an example. They assimilate the oblique course of the planets to the body of a serpent, but that of the sun to the figure of a scarabæus. In reference to the knowledge actually acquired of the literature of ancient Egypt by means of the late discoveries in hieroglyphics, we are not entitled to speak in boastful or very confident language. The wasting hand of time, which has rendered its effects visible even on the pyramids, has entirely destroyed the more perishable materials to which the sages of Thebes and the magicians of Memphis may have committed the science of their several generations. We know, too, that the bigotry of ignorance and of superstition accomplished in many cases what the flood of years had permitted to escape. For which reason we must not estimate the extent of acquirement among the wise men of Egypt by the scanty remains of their labors which have been casually rescued from accident and violence. From Diodorus Siculus we receive the information that in the tomb of Ozymandias were deposited 20,000 volumes, a number which is reduced by Manetho to 3,525. All of which, on account of their antiquity or the importance of their subjects, were ascribed to Thoth or Hermes, who, it is well known, united in his character the intelligence of a divinity with the patriotism of a faithful minister. Of these works, which unquestionably belong to a very remote antiquity, we have a short account supplied by a Christian bishop, Clemens of Alexandria, who appears to have devoted much attention to the learning of the ancient Egyptians. In that country, he tells us, every individual cultivates a different branch of philosophy, an arrangement which applies chiefly to their holy ceremonies. In such processions, the singer occupies the first place, carrying in his hand an instrument of music. He is said to be obliged to learn two of the books of Hermes, one of which contains hymns addressed to the gods, and the other, the rules by which a prince ought to govern. Next comes the horoscopus, holding a clock and the branch of a palm tree, which are the symbols of astrology. He must be completely master of the 4 books of Hermes which treat of that science. One of these explains the order of the fixed stars. The second, the motion and phases of the sun and moon. The other 2 determine the times of their periodical rising. Then follows the hierogrammatist or sacred scribe with 2 feathers on his head and a book and ruler in his hand, to which are added the instruments of writing, some ink, and a reed. He must know what are called hieroglyphics, and those branches of science which belong to cosmography, geography, and astronomy, especially the laws of the sun, moon, and 5 planets. He must be acquainted with the territorial distribution of Egypt, the course of the Nile, the furniture of the temples, and of all consecrated places. After these is an officer denominated Stolistes, who bears a square rule as the emblem of justice and the cup of libations. His charge includes everything which belongs to the education of youth, as well as to sacrifices, first fruits, hymns, prayers, religious pomps, festivals and commemorations, the rules for which are contained in 10 books. This functionary is succeeded by one called the prophet, who displays in his bosom a jar or vessel meant for carrying water, a symbol thought to represent the deity, but which more probably had a reference to the sacred character of the Nile. He is attended by persons bearing bread cut into slices. The duty of the prophet as president of the mysteries, according to Volney's citation of this passage, made it necessary for him to be perfectly acquainted with the 10 books called sacerdotal, and which treat of the laws of the gods and of the whole discipline of the priesthood. He also presides over the distribution of the sacred revenue, that is, the income arising from the performance of pious rites and dedicated to the support of religious institutions. Hence, there are 42 books of Hermes, the knowledge of which is absolutely necessary. Of these, 36, containing the whole philosophy of the Egyptians, are carefully studied by the persons whom we have mentioned, and the remaining 6 are learned by the pastophori, or inferior priests, as they belong to anatomy, to nosology, to instruments of surgery, to pharmacy, to the diseases of the eye, and to the maladies of women. This distribution of the sciences does not enable us to determine either the principles on which they were founded or the extent to which they were pursued. We possess a better criterion in the perfection to which the people of Egypt, at a very early period, had carried some of those arts which have a close dependence upon scientific deductions. The prodigies of Thebes could not have been accomplished by a nation ignorant of mathematics and chemistry, nor could the pyramids, the obelisks and the monolithic temples, which still meet the eye of the traveler in almost every spot between Elephantine and the mouths of the Nile, have been raised without the aid of such mechanical powers as have their origin in the calculations of philosophy. Here we have the archetype of Masonic processions on festival days and other important occasions. I shall hereafter give a detailed account of those which took place in London on laying the cornerstone and on the dedication of Freemasons' Hall. We see here also the original of the square rule as a Masonic symbol. It was, in Egypt, an emblem of justice, because it was the means by which was ascertained the boundaries of lands that had been obscured or carried away by the inundation. We here, moreover, recognize the holy or sacred scribe of a royal arch chapter, with a book and ruler in his hand. The original book, containing the laws of Egypt relating to sacrifices and other matters appertaining to religion not having been preserved, Masonry substitutes for it the Bible, which is opened at the beginning of the Gospel of St. John, and with the square and compasses laid thereon is ceremonially carried in the processions. The jar or vessel spoken of was undoubtedly one of the canopy, which indicated the different heights of the Nile, and for this reason acquired a sanctity among the people. The 3 pitchers carried in Masonic processions no doubt originally alluded to the Egyptian canopy. As to the learning, so much boasted of by the craft, and which seems to be claimed by them as an inheritance from their predecessors, it is to be feared that it remains buried in the tomb of Ozymandias. The hymns or odes and songs, as well as prayers, are retained in great abundance and compose an essential part of the Masonic ceremonies. Attributing the authorship of 20,000 or even 3,525 volumes to Thoth or Hermes is an evidence of his being a fictitious character and corroborates the opinion of Pluche on the subject. Jamblichus, however, puts this matter beyond controversy. He says, Hermes, the god who presides over language, was formerly very properly considered as common to all priests, and the power who presides over the true science concerning the gods is one and the same in the whole of things. Hence our ancestors dedicated the inventions of their wisdom to this deity, inscribing all their own writings with the name of Hermes. Volney, who in his ruins quotes part of the foregoing extract from Clemens, observes that Mercury, who is the same as Hermes, is the Janus of the Romans, the Guianese of the Indians, and it is remarkable that Janus and Guianese are synonymous. In short, it appears that these books are the source of all that has been transmitted to us by the Greeks and Latins in every science, even in alchemy, necromancy, etc. What is most to be regretted in their loss is that part which related to the principles of medicine and diet, in which the Egyptians appear to have made considerable progress and useful observations. Remains of the ancient arts in various parts of Egypt. Dendera, which is commonly identified with the ancient Teutura, presents some very striking examples of that sumptuous architecture which the people of Egypt lavished upon their places of worship. The gateway in particular, which leads to the temple of Isis, has excited universal admiration. Each front, as well as the interior, is covered with sculptured hieroglyphics which are executed with a richness, a precision, elegance of form, and variety of ornament, surpassing in many respects the similar edifices which are found at Thebes and Philo. The height is 42 feet, the width 33, and the depth 17. Advancing along the brick ruins, says Dr. Richardson, we came to an elegant gateway or propylon, which is also of sandstone, neatly hewn and completely covered with sculpture and hieroglyphics, remarkably well cut. Immediately over the center of the doorway is the beautiful Egyptian ornament, usually called the globe, with serpent and wings, emblematical of the glorious sun poised in the airy firmament of heaven, supported and directed in his course by the eternal wisdom of the deity. The sublime phraseology of Scripture, the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing on his wings, could not be more emphatically or more accurately represented to the human eye than by this elegant device. The temple itself still retains all its original magnificence. The centuries which have elapsed since the era of its foundation have scarcely affected it in any important part, and have impressed upon it no greater appearance of age than serves to render it more venerable and imposing. The knowledge of astronomy leads to the interpretation of hieroglyphical characters, since astronomical signs are often found on the ancient Egyptian monuments, which were probably employed by the priests to record dates. On the ceiling of the portico of the temple among the ruins of Tentera, there is a long row of figures of men and animals following each other in the same direction. Among these are the 12 signs of the zodiac, placed according to the motion of the sun. It is probable that the first figure in the procession represents the beginning of the year. Now the first is the lion, as if coming out of the temple. And it is well known that the agricultural year of the Egyptians commenced at the solstice of summer, the epoch of the inundation of the Nile. Then, if the preceding hypothesis be true, the solstice at the time the temple was built must have happened in the constellation of the Lion. But as the solstice now happens 21 degrees 6 north of the constellation of the Twins, it is easy to compute that the zodiac of Tentera must have been made 4,000 years ago. Dissertation on the Mechanism of the Heavens by Mrs. Somerville. To Mr. Hamilton, who had seen innumerable monuments of the same kind throughout the Thebaid, it seemed as if he were now witnessing the highest degree of architectural excellence that had ever been attained on the borders of the Nile. Here were concentrated the united labors of ages and the last effort of human art and industry in that uniform line of construction which had been adopted in the earliest times. The portico consists of 24 columns in 3 rows, each above 22 feet in circumference, 32 feet high, and covered with hieroglyphics. On the front, Isis is in general the principal figure to whom offerings are made. On the architrave are represented 2 processions of men and women bringing to their goddess, and to Osiris, who is sitting behind her, globes encompassed with cow's horns, mitred snakes, lotus flowers, vases, little boats, graduated staves, and other instruments of their emblematical worship. The interior of the pronaos is adorned with sculptures, most of them preserving part of the paint with which they have been covered. Those on the ceiling are peculiarly rich and varied, all illustrative of the union between the astronomical and religious creeds of the ancient Egyptians. Yet, though each separate figure is well preserved and perfectly intelligible, we must be more intimately acquainted with the real principles of the sciences as they were then taught before we can undertake to explain the signs in which they were embodied. The sekos, or interior of the temple, consists of several apartments, all the walls and ceilings of which are in the same way covered with religious and astronomical representations. The rooms have been lighted by small perpendicular holes cut in the ceiling, and where it was possible to introduce them, by oblique ones in the sides. but some idea might be formed of the perpetual gloom in which the apartments on the ground floor of the sekos must have been buried, from the fact that where no sidelight could be introduced, all they received was communicated from the apartment above. So that, notwithstanding the cloudless sky and the brilliant colors on the walls, the place must have been always well calculated for the mysterious practices of the religion to which it was consecrated. On one corner of the roof there was a chapel or temple 20 feet square, consisting of 12 columns, exactly similar in figure and proportions to those of the pronaos. The use to which it may have been applied must probably remain one of the secrets connected with the mystical and sometimes cruel service in which the priests of Isis were employed. Towards the eastern end of the roof are two separate sets of apartments, one on the north and the other on the south side of it. The ceiling of the next room is divided into two compartments by a figure of Isis in very high relief. In one of them is the circular zodiac, in the other a variety of boats with 4 or 5 human figures in each, one of whom is in the act of spearing a large egg, while others are stamping with their feet upon the victims of their fury, among which are several human beings. Near this scene, a large lion, supported by 4 dog-headed figures, each carrying a knife, may be regarded as an additional type of the sanguinary purposes for which the apartment was used. The walls of the third room are covered with the several representations of a person, first at the point of death lying on a couch, then stretched out, lifeless upon a bier, and finally, being embalmed. The western wall of the great temple is particularly interesting for the extreme elegance of the sculpture. Here are frequent representations of men who seem prepared for slaughter or just going to be put to death. On these occasions, one or more appear with their hands or legs tied to the trunk of a tree in the most painful and distorted attitudes. In a small chapel behind the temple, the cow and the hawk seem to have been particularly worshipped, as priests are frequently seen kneeling before them, presenting sacrifices and offerings. In the center of the ceiling is the same front face of Isis in high relief, illuminated, as it were, by a body of rays issuing from the mouth of the same long figure which, in the other temples, appears to encircle the heavenly bodies. About 200 yards eastward from this chapel is a propylon of small dimensions, resembling in form that which conducts to the great temple, and, like it, built in a line with the wall which surrounds the sacred enclosure. Among the sculptures on it, which appear of the same style but less finished than those on the large temple, little more is worthy of notice than the frequent exhibition of human slaughter by men or by lions. Still farther towards the east there is another propylon equally well preserved with the rest, about 40 feet in height and 20 feet square at the base. Among the sacred figures on this building is an Isis, pointing with a reed to a graduated staff held by another figure of the same deity, from which are suspended scales containing water animals, the whole group perhaps being an emblem of her influence over the Nile in regulating its periodical inundations. The signs of the zodiac portrayed in the center of the roof of Freemasons' Hall, London, are in accordance with the astronomical decorations of the ancient temples of Egypt. Celestial and terrestrial globes also compose a part of the Masonic emblems. The author seems not to be aware that the Isis, pointing with a reed to a graduated staff, was directing the attention of the Egyptians to the nilometer, or measure of the inundation, so important to their well-being. This measure in after times, as before noticed, became an ensign of office, Mercury's wand, and as such has been adopted by Masonry. The cruelty is supposed to be connected with the Egyptian mode of worship, as indicated by the appearance of persons under torture. The reader will find in the sequel were nothing more than sham representations of the punishment said to be inflicted upon the wicked in another life. The contrast displayed in the death of a virtuous character, carefully embalmed, clearly points out the intention of these representations. The apartments where these awful figures were portrayed were no doubt the first into which candidates for initiation into the mysteries were introduced. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.